Welcome, Tristram. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
So I like to start with this point of controversy, and that's the idea that we need to double food production by 2050 in order to feed the expected 9 billion people. But you disagree with this. Can you explain to me what's wrong with this idea?
It's a great place to start this conversation because that is the whole reason why food waste matters. We're being told by the big corporations, Monsanto, Cargill, and even venerable institutions like the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations that we need to massively boost global food production by 50, 60, 70, or 100%, depending on who you're listening to. Now, there are two problems with this proposition, or what you could call this dominant paradigm within the food system. I call it the dominant paradigm because that is the main driver in the food system today, is we've got to grow more. The first problem with this proposition is that is the very worst environmental activity that is going on right now. That is why the Amazon rainforest is being chopped down to grow more food, turn the forest into fields. It is why the Southeast Asian rainforests have been completely decimated and why they continue to be destroyed to grow more food. It's why Central Africa is being deforested. It is the reason why the extension of the agricultural frontier is being pushed further and further into the remaining wild places of planet Earth. And this activity is threatening the long-term viability of our living Earth, let alone our food system that depends on that living Earth. So this strategy as a way of relieving pressure on the food system or somehow kind of creating enough food to feed 9 billion people expected on the planet by 2050 is in fact probably the surest way of undermining the planet's ability to feed the human population in the long term. So as a strategy, it is suicidal. So that's the first problem. The second problem with this proposition is that it's wrong. We don't need to increase food production by that amount to feed the human population of Earth. And the reason why I'm sure of that is that firstly, we already grow enough food to feed the human population. The problem is that in rich countries, we eat too much food. We in particular eat way more meat and dairy products than is good for our own health, let alone the health of the planet. And thirdly, as you so clearly delineated in your introduction, we waste a third, at least, of the world's food production. And there is where we need to focus our attention if what we want is increasing food availability without screwing the planet. And I would argue that is a much more, much safer strategy than saying we need to double food production. Final comment on that is that there are some parts of the world where increasing food production would be no bad thing. Indeed, is important for achieving food security. Sub-Saharan Africa would be a clear example of that. But that is very different from saying globally what we need urgently is to double food production.
Thank you. So can you just when we're talking about food waste and a third of the food being wasted, what is this food waste and where is it coming from? Is it the domesticated food waste that we chuck out at home, or is it in the farms? Is it in the supermarkets?
It's all of those. If you start at the farm gate, in developing world countries, very often it is a farmer's lack of farm infrastructure to preserve, store, and bring to market the food that they've already grown. Things like grain silos to store grain so it doesn't go moldy or get eaten by weevils in Africa and many parts of Asia. Those things are lacking. And that's a clear waste of food and on-farm income where it's really needed. In rich countries, the on-farm food waste tends to be more to do with completely unnecessary things like cosmetic standards laid down by supermarkets on fruit and vegetables. So you get mountains of bananas and tangerines and parsnips and you name it. And that's because it doesn't look right.
I heard that I think WRAP did a research paper last year in July, and it said 3.6 million tons were wasted at the farm level.
So Feedback, the charity that I founded, has been pushing on the on-farm food waste front for many, many years. And one of the things that we've constantly been pointing out is that whereas consumers have had their bins forensically raked through government-funded, RAP-executed studies on food waste, no one had ever bothered to go and look at the ginormous waste of perfectly good food on farms. And therefore our data at Feedback was based on, frankly, our own visits to farms, our conversations with farmers, the gleaning network that actually goes and recuperates some of this food. And so finally, after many years of lobbying, RAP was commissioned to do this on-farm food waste study. I will say it's very, very partial. They've only studied 1 or 2 crops, and it is still very much a guesstimate. But certainly millions of tons of produce get wasted in this country. More importantly, for a country that imports more than half net by value of its food, a lot of the food that is wasted on farms in our supply chains is overseas. I have been to Peru, I've been to Ecuador, I've been to Colombia, I've been to Kenya, I've been to the farms that are constantly growing produce for our supermarkets. And I've never been more ashamed of being British, frankly, meeting Kenyan farmers who tell me that they routinely waste half of their harvests because they don't look right. The supermarkets don't want them, and very often actually don't harvest at all because an order has been cancelled at the last minute. And this is the kind of waste that is not just a burden on the environment, but an economic loss to the people at the very bottom of our economic pyramid. These are people on less than $2 a day. They don't get paid when they're destroying crops that have been grown for us. Not paying Africans for hard labor is something that we used to call slavery. That still exists within our food supply chain today under a different name, and it is utterly shameful.
And this is what's so scary about the argument that we need to double food production, because that kind of crisis mentality often means more power goes to the corporations or to governments, and it's just this obsession with increasing produce rather than actually looking at what are the effects of the produce, how can we make the systems more efficient. And within this, all kind of environmental justice and social justice elements, well, it's not even that they're an element, they're like the whole, get completely subsumed within this like obsession with producing more and more and more so that we can consume more and more and more. But actually there already is enough calories that we're producing more calories than we need to feed the entire world. But people aren't being given the food because of the inefficient way in which the system has been set up. But that system is a choice. The food system doesn't need to be functioning this way.
Absolutely. That's exactly the problem. This need, so-called, to massively boost food production is the green light that the big corporations want to start up the bulldozers and drive across the Amazon. And that is exactly what has been happening and what continues indeed under an accelerated rate with the Bolsonaro regime in Brazil. That is really perpetuating the very worst environmental damage going on at the moment.
Yeah. And I think we need
I wanted to just say, the need that these corporations are talking about is not, in fact, a nutritional need of the human population. The need, if you read between the lines that they're talking about, is their need as profit-making corporations to generate the maximum financial returns for their owners and shareholders. And that, unfortunately, is the principal driver of the food system today. Yes, people get fed, and it is miraculous what this incredibly complicated system does actually deliver food all over the world. But its primary function, in fact, the primary driver of the food system is the profit that is being generated by corporations. Now, there is nothing inherently wrong, in my view, with business and profit. The problem is that we lack the regulatory framework to contain the activities of those corporations within a system that protects the actual needs, the biological needs of the human population and the rest of the planet. If we had an international agreement, let's say, that put a moratorium on the deforestation of virgin forests, then you could allow corporations to go and increase food production as far as they possibly can without undermining the life system on Earth. So that would be perhaps new technologies that can increase yields, that can keep food fresher for longer. All of those things that increase food productivity can do that without the environmental impacts of the traditional way of increasing food, which is take over more land.
Yeah. And I think, because this is something whilst EcoResolution has been looking into food and farming, this is an area I've been really aware of as we've been researching. It's that the argument around having to double up food production gives way to many scary lines of argument and thought. So I think, I'm not sure if this is the case, but I know a few years ago, Monsanto's kind of mission and vision was to be able to feed the world, but through them doing that, they then pumped, it's basically corporate takeover of land, undermining communities, having the patents on the seeds. It's just a corporate takeover, and the end goal is not about nutrition for the masses. It's about control, it seems, of the masses through the food system. What are some of the solutions that you believe in from the top level?
So I believe that we are all bound to respond to this crisis, the environmental crisis, the food crisis, by taking action in our own lives in every way we possibly can. And luckily, we already do know how to do food systems in ways that can actually not just stop this environmental damage, but start to undo it. We know how to do farming in a way that can suck carbon out of the atmosphere and stick it into the ground. That's actually what plants have been doing for billions of years. We know how to produce food in ways that can replenish water systems rather than extract from them. We know how to do food in ways that can create habitat for wildlife rather than destroy it. And every day, we, as consumers of food, have the opportunity to contribute to that kind of food system rather than to the one that is extractive, destructive, and really is the majority of food production. That said, I believe that there is a limit to what we can achieve as individuals, and whilst it is morally and ethically the right thing for us to do on a daily basis, contributing to that regenerative food system, I believe that it is the governments that represent us, ultimately at the moment through the nation state institutions that are the most powerful civic responsibility entities on the planet. It is their job to protect planet Earth from the ravages of the profit-driven food system. Ultimately, I do not believe that we can achieve the changes that we need without that kind of intervention. So I mentioned an example. We need to stop chopping down the world's forests. And that is something that clearly needs to be agreed by the nation states between them. Obviously, putting a cap on carbon dioxide emissions would be a great start. And there's obviously lots of momentum behind that and very little action. I think another area that is probably underrepresented in most people's minds, at least, is the use of farm subsidies. In Europe and the USA, there are billions and billions and billions of dollars or euros or pounds being spent on propping up an ecocidal agricultural system, producing food that is both damaging to the environment and also quite manifestly damaging to human health. Using those billions of taxpayers' money to fund an ecologically regenerative farming system is, in my view, probably the single biggest policy opportunity on Earth to tackle the environmental crisis. Farmland is capable of absorbing one heck of a lot of carbon. and if we paid farmers to adopt farming practices that we already know work to embed carbon in their soils and take it out of the atmosphere, that would both reverse the soil degradation trends that we're seeing the world over, at the same time as reversing climate change.
Yeah.
And those policy decisions are ones, again, that need to be made by our nation-state governments in international fora. And I believe that is a colossal opportunity that we should all be driving for.
I completely agree. And on previous episodes, we were speaking to Tracy Worcester from Farms Not Factories, when we were talking about the industrial issues behind industrial and intensive farming. And we've also been speaking with Soil Association as well about how scary the soil depletion is, but also how it needn't. None of this has to be this way. These are all systems that we have created. Humans have created them. Let's change them. And I'm really happy that you've kind of shifted the attention away from the consumer, where it usually is. It's like, lots of people think about food waste, to address it, think they need to then, be more careful with their food shops, which obviously we need to do, obviously. But there's this really interesting relationship between individual actions and then governmental actions, and between the bottom up movements and top down change making. And these really need to start to come together. And I believe that on the side of the individual and the consumer, it's really important that you address the challenges in your own life so that you have the awareness and, I guess, maybe authenticity, maybe that's not the right word, but to demand the top-down change. So if on a daily basis you're really aware of your food waste and of the food waste around you, you're more likely going to be demanding the change from governments. And also I think it just corporations at the end of the day need consumers to like them and to believe in them. And I think the more that public consciousness increases as to the huge issue of food waste, the more likely it is we're going to get this top-down change. But how is the work that you're doing and organizations that you've been involved in going in demanding top-down change?
Well, just to start with a little preamble, and that is people get very confused and dispirited by the mismatch between their own individual actions and the global impacts that we want to see. And it's perfectly understandable. I sometimes find this an interesting and helpful way of kind of conceptualizing it. We all know it's the wrong thing to go and mug a grandmother, bop her on the head and steal her wallet. And so we don't do it. It's not a very nice thing to do. It's immoral, unethical behavior. And yet we all recognize that choosing not to do that on a daily basis contributes in a negligible way towards the achievement of world peace. The achievement of world peace is in the hands of institutions like nation-state governments, but also many others. And that work also has to happen. But the fact that our non-contribution to that ultimate goal by not behaving unethically towards the grandmother crossing the road is no indication that we should therefore go and mug grandmothers. Do you see what I mean? So the individual action is the right thing to do, irrespective of whether it contributes in a significant way towards the achievement of the ultimate goal. And I feel that the same is true of our interactions with food, and indeed our economic actions generally. We do the right thing because it's the right thing to do, and we also need governments that represent us to adopt the right policies to protect our longer term future on a larger scale. Yes. And how is that going? Well, I think that on the one hand, having campaigned on the issue of food waste for 20 years, and it's been 10 years now since the publication of my book, 10 years since I created that first Feeding the 5,000 event in London, which then spread all over the world. We've done that in more than 50 times in cities all over the world, and many, many different event formats of that nature, hundreds and hundreds of mobilizing actions, and the tidal wave of enthusiasm, grassroots activism, corporate engagement, nation-state policy production, international institutions, the United Nations and the World Bank. We now have a Sustainable Development Goal, of which I'm an official champion, to halve food waste by 2030, which pretty much every single country in the world has signed up to. I sit down at a table and the CEOs of Unilever, of Tesco, of the World Bank, some of the biggest organizations on the planet are there, focusing on halving food waste by 2030. It has been a phenomenal change and much easier than I thought it could possibly be. So I really want to give credit, and I want us all to know that we really can be part of a meaningful change, the way in which thousands, if not millions now, of activists and actors the world over have created this cultural shift. It's really, really phenomenal. That said, the food system is still accelerating in the wrong direction globally. I believe that one of the fundamental problems that we have is that the nation-state system itself is almost completely unable, certainly ill-equipped, to cope with global decision-making. Unfortunately, what we have is international fora where we send our nation-state governments as representatives of their electorates to go and carve out the biggest slice of cake for their electorates. That's their job description. And that is why we have the perpetuation of the tragedy of the commons that I see on planet Earth. That is why climate change negotiations have failed to yield results. That is why the oceans continue to be stripped of their natural bounty, because it makes rational sense for countries to continue to fight for the biggest slice of the cake. What we need is a very different forum for global decision-making, one a bit more like the European Union, where we send representatives from our governments, not as representatives of their electorate, but to go and decide what is best for everyone. That institution does not exist yet. And I think our biggest effort now should be to help this global culture emerge. We are one planet, and the nations are a mental construct that is currently massively inhibiting our ability to protect this one beautiful planet that we depend on.
I'm very inspired by the people's assemblies that Extinction Rebellion have been working on as trying to get more participatory democracy occurring, and just kind of like practicing what that actually looks like. I've really enjoyed those.
I don't know if you've checked out Democracy Earth, which is an organisation that does what it says on the tin. Yeah. It is an online participatory democracy. It's a liquid democracy system essentially built on the blockchain. And it is the kind of futuristic global decision making where we and our brothers and sisters in Peru and Mexico and South Africa can all participate in global decisions. And that has got to be the future. Yeah.
Well, I think on one hand, it's obvious the environmental destruction that we're currently facing that's so embedded within the systems and climate collapse. So such a terrifying and anxiety-inducing, fear-inducing thing to be faced with, but also, I think, such an incredible opportunity in that these are symptoms of systems that are just broken, and it's laughable that it's not laughable, but it is also laughable at how there is just not the action that needs to be being taken, because like we've been saying, like solutions to a lot of these crises are just out there. Just make the food system more efficient so that we're not fueling this really destructive mechanism. But I think, the fact that these issues can bind us together globally, even more so, I think is really inspiring and a great opportunity for us to move forwards united and together.
I completely agree. I don't have a spiritual practice like meditation or yoga or anything, but I think belatedly I've realized that my spiritual practice that is run throughout my work is companionship. Companion is my favorite word. is the Latin for with, of course, and pan is the Latin for bread. And companionship is the sharing of bread. Humans universally practice the sharing of food as a way of building friendship, of building community. And it is through the eating of food together, both literally and metaphorically, that I think we can both re-establish a beautiful connection between humans and the living earth and between each other. And I think what we're looking at when we see a third of the world's food being wasted and other egregious examples of, the food system at its worst, that's a failure of companionship, failure to look after our fellow humans. 1 billion people hungry and then we waste enough to feed them several times over. That's a failure of companionship. And if we focus on building companionship through great meals, great gatherings, having a good time with each other and building those connections between each other and the earth, that I think is a wonderful recipe for both achieving the global transformation that we need to aim for, but also having a great time. And I think that second point is so important when we're up against phenomenally powerful entities that do not have our interests at heart. It's so easy to burn out and get lost in the fight. And it's so important to celebrate and enjoy and rejoice. And, well, the motto of Toast Ale, of course, is throw a better party than the people destroying it. That is how we're going to build this global movement. Yes,
and I wanted to talk to you about Toast Ale. Can you explain a little bit about this? Because I feel like Toast Ale also, it brings together, celebrating like life as we make positive change, but also it has a very communal aspect to it as well.
Well, just a little potted history. I used to campaign pretty much solo, and then I founded this organization, Feedback, the charity that has taken the fight against food waste and now increasingly the fight against all the other environmental ills, the meat production, sugar production. These are systemic problems that Feedback has been set up to tackle, and to do it through grassroots activation and enjoyment and feeding the 5,000, quintessential example of a kind of let's throw a party to show the kind of reality that we want to bring in and replace the existing one. And then years later, fundraising for that organization was always and continues to be a pain. And so I thought, well, I'll set up a for-profit company that hopefully at some point will start generating the funds that can feed into Feedback's unrestricted pool of money so that the organization can do whatever it wants. And so I set up Toast Ale as a for-profit that gives its profits to Feedback. And the activity of Toast Ale is to take perfectly good bread that is being wasted on an industrial scale the world over, while it is sometimes day fresh. We're talking about the end slices of loaves going to sandwich manufacturers, which of course don't end up in the sandwiches, which is a shame. I like sandwiches, crusty sandwiches myself, but there they aren't. And so we save that bread, and we are bringing the brewing of beer back to its ancient origins by using that stuff to ferment into beer. The ancient Babylonians created beer first and foremost as a preservation technology. Fermentation is preservation. The alcohol and the inebriation that results is a happy accident. First and foremost, what they're doing is preserving the calories in those grains so they don't go moldy into a long shelf life liquid form. And old bread was part of the recipe. And so that is what we use. It's not moldy. It's perfectly good bread. And we add that to the brewing process, totally natural brewing process, and end up with Toast Ale, which is a fun and celebratory way of saying at the moment we have a crisis in the food system. And the best way we can tackle that is to get together, throw a big party, and celebrate the, in this case, liquid solutions to the problem.
And isn't it that anyone anywhere in the world can create their own Toast Ale or become like an ambassador?
That is the long-term aim. We did open source our recipe.
What does that mean?
On our website. So we put our recipe on our website.
Okay.
It has been downloaded 80,000 times by brewers all over the world. We want home brewers to be using up the old bread in their homes, in their friends' homes, that we will never, have any access to or want to.
Yeah.
We want microbrewers in villages and towns around the world to be going to their local bakery and using that stuff. And we want the industrial brewers to do the same. And all of that is now happening. We do want to do that in partnership with Toast Ale. If somebody doesn't want to do it with Toast, that's a shame, but, we've open sourced it. It means anyone can do it.
Yeah.
It's more important that this happens than that it all happens under our roof. But that said, we do want to create a global, in fact, it is happening now, even as Toast Ale as a company, it's doubled in size year on year over the last couple of years. And, looks like it's going to continue to grow at a really good rate. There are also loads of other things going on outside of Toast Ale, which will, I believe, stick. The use of bread that would otherwise have been wasted in the brewing industry is here to stay.
Yeah, I love it. Getting wasted on waste.
Well, we say that bread shouldn't be wasted, neither should you, so please drink responsibly. Okay. That's on every bottle.
Thank you. I'll remember that. And what are other delicious solutions to the food waste crisis?
Well, before I set up Toast Ale, I had the enormous privilege and pleasure to help numerous other entrepreneurs launch companies with a view to tackling food waste. When I wrote my book, I was talking about the billions of dollars of value that are available in the 1.3 billion tons of food that humans manage to waste each year.
Say that again?
1.3 billion tons of food that humans waste every year.
What's the fight? Sorry, quick. What's the fight? Like, how much money is that?
Oh gosh, you put me on the spot there.
Sorry.
I will have to look it up, but it's over $1 trillion worth of food.
Wow.
And so that's a massive economic opportunity. And sure enough, the entrepreneurs and the investors of this world have been going after that ever since. I remember Mark Zorns, who was at McKinsey at the time, and wrote this big report on resource efficiency opportunities in the world, of which food waste was number 3 the world over. He went off to form EcoResolution, which helps catering companies to cut down on their waste using its digital measurement tool, and now a kind of artificial eye that sees the food waste and tells the restaurant manager what food not to order more of next time, and that kind of thing. You've got companies like Ruby's in the Rubble that is producing delicious chutneys and ketchups with fruit and vegetables that would otherwise be wasted. Many people will be on the Olio app, which allows neighbours to share the food that they have in their fridge with each other. So if you're going on a holiday and you've got some surplus food and you just put it up on there, someone will come and get it. Too Good To Go and Karma, which are enabling companies to sell surplus stock at the end of the day at a discount to happy customers. You've got Oddbox selling ugly fruit and vegetables. The US equivalent, Imperfect, on the West Coast, which was actually, the directors were introduced to each other. I introduced them at the Feeding the 5,000 that we did in 2014 in Berkeley. That has now, I think it's around $12 or $13 million of revenue a year selling ugly fruits and vegetables in veg boxes to customers across California. And it's just the beginning. And there are now hundreds of entrepreneurs of this type the world over tackling the problem from that perspective, the entrepreneurial economic opportunity perspective. We set up a whole organization called the Food Waste Innovation Network, Foodwin Nasbanal, based in Brussels, bringing these entrepreneurs together. I'll be speaking at their festival in a couple of weeks.
Why, just for a bit of context about ugly fruit and veg, what is that all about? And earlier on you also spoke about like the cosmetic side and that being a big reason why so much is wasted. Could you explain that a little bit?
Yes. So ugly fruit and vegetables can come into, it depends on how geeky we want to get. On the surface, supermarkets say that customers only want to buy perfect produce. And when there is a pile of product that is loose, people do quite often leave the wonky or damaged ones behind. And that's the evidence base for that claim. However, if you market ugly produce as ugly produce and say, well, these apples, there was hail in the autumn and they got a little bit of rusting on the skin, and you tell that story, that's actually something that people are attracted by. If you sell them at a discount, people buy them. If you bag them up with, regular produce, people don't even notice. And that has been repeatedly demonstrated on the market now, people selling ugly fruit and vegetables. And yet that hasn't got rid of the problem. And whilst I think that marketing ugly fruit and vegetables are a great way of educating the public, I think there is another side to this which doesn't get as much airtime. And that is that supermarkets benefit from a food supply chain that is constantly in surplus. And what this means is that if they say, we have a cosmetic standard that results in you wasting 20 to 30% of your produce on a regular year, they then have the ability, if, for example, what happened in 2007, 2008, we lost nearly half of the potatoes in this country because of the rain that made all the potatoes go green. And we didn't import any more potatoes than normal. And the reason for that is that all the supermarkets did is they relaxed their cosmetic standards so that the potatoes that were normally being rejected from the supply chain were just being accepted. So they could step forward and say, don't worry about what it looks like, we'll take them anyway. As soon as there is plenty again, they can continue to reject the farmer's product and say, well, we don't want it. The reason why they don't want it is because they don't need it. They've got plenty of other potatoes. But having that surplus buffer always there at the farmer's cost is very useful, so that there's always plenty for them when and as they need it, but they don't have to pay for it when they don't want it.
That must be really stressful for the farmers if they're going through their fruit and I don't know. It seems so crazy to or the amount of work that goes into growing food to then have to start measuring the food that comes out of the...
So that is part of it. One of the things that happened in the last few years, we passed in this country a landmark piece of legislation, the Groceries Code Adjudicator Act, that stops supermarkets from cancelling orders at the last minute. And that's because, supermarkets were using the power that they have to kind of just say, oh, we don't want that product. We found cheaper stuff elsewhere, or consumers aren't buying it. They were transferring the risk to the producer and therefore the cost of the risk in the market to the producer. And the Competition Commission said, you've got to stop doing that. That's anti-competitive behaviour. Couldn't put in place a code of practice. There is now a part of the government, the Groceries Code Adjudicator, who is responsible for making sure that supermarkets don't do that anymore. This cosmetic standard threshold is one of the ways in which supermarkets are perpetuating that system. So instead of saying, we don't want it anymore, we're cancelling that order, they're just looking at it and saying, oh, it doesn't meet our standards, so we're going to reject it. As I say, if they wanted it, they would take it anyway, even though it doesn't comply. So it puts them in a position of power.
Supermarkets need to be addressed, clearly. And what about their sell-by date process? Because I know there's a lot of confusion around sell-by dates, and often things say that they're off when actually they're not off.
For sure. Of course, a lot of in particular, best before dates, sell-by dates, display until dates, these are not necessary to take all that seriously. The use-by date, of course, is a food safety warning, and anything with one of those should be treated with more caution. But even then, you've got to bear in mind that a corporation's biggest nightmare is a health scare. Somebody's got food poisoning from their product that can destroy an entire business overnight. We've seen a few examples of that. So surprise, surprise, those use-by dates are super, super, super conservative. Okay. And they assume a worst case scenario. You've left your block of cheese in a warm car for 3 days in the summer, taken it home, half warmed it up, given it to your grandmother who's got a low immune system. And even then, you've got to make sure that never happens. So you add an extra bit of a buffer. Okay. So, those are the ways in which these use-by dates are calculated, and just bear that in mind. But I do want to say, before we get too deep into the whole like supermarket, what do they do? I find that the single best way of dealing with this problem is just avoid going into a supermarket at all, if you possibly can. And the main reason for that is because all of these little things like the sell-by dates or the cosmetic standards, they're like they're the trees. But let's see the wood for the moment. And the wood is that supermarkets are structured around a marketing system of cornucopia in abundance, this heaps of produce. We have been hardwired by millions of years of evolution in an environment of scarcity. When we see abundance like that, it is an instinct to take some of it and put it into our basket. And supermarkets have invested billions of dollars in working this kind of thing out, working what it is that triggers our take response. And as soon as you're in their environment, you are subjected to that incredibly powerful marketing campaign to get you to buy stuff. And I think I'm one of the most anti-consumerist kind of, people I know. And I still find it really difficult if I end up going into a supermarket not thinking, oh, yeah, I need some of that and I need some of that. And you end up, instead of buying one thing, like buying a whole basket full of stuff. And that is one of the main reasons why week after week consumers in this country are buying 20 or more % more food every week than they actually need and chucking the rest away. And now there are these wonderful companies that will deliver food to your door, like vegetable boxes and stuff, that can just help you, save the time of going and queuing in the supermarket, but just getting yourself out of that environment.
Yeah.